Hello students, in this video we are going to discuss deferred modification technique. Before going to discuss deferred modification technique, let us have a quick overview on what is immediate database modification technique, because this technique is more related to deferred modification technique. It's also one of the log based recovery technique. Okay, in immediate database modification technique, changes which need to be made to the databases are immediately performed after the execution of each operation of the transaction and after making the corresponding entry into the log. That is the reason this technique is known as immediate database modification technique. Whereas coming to deferred modification technique, changes which need to be made to the databases are deferred until the partial commit of the transaction and after making the entries into the log. That is the reason this technique is known as deferred modification technique. In this technique, the log records which are used to maintain the log records which are used to record the activities of transactions are start record, update record, commit record, even abort record also are used. Even in immediate database modification also, these are the log records used for recording the activities of transactions. Whereas coming to a recovery procedure, in case of deferred modification technique, only the redo procedure is used for recovering the database to its consistent state. Here in case of immediate database modification technique, two recovery procedures are used to recover the database to its consistent state whenever the system failure occurs. Okay, let us now discuss how database modification technique records the activities of transactions and how it applies the recovery procedure when system failure occurs to restore the database to its consistent state with suitable example. Here in deferred database modification technique, we are going to take two transactions in a serial schedule. First transaction is T0. When it starts its execution, that is when it executes begin operation, then it records T0 start log entry into log. Then when it performs the write operation on A, it makes update record into the log. This update record you can observe. It contains T0, it is the transaction identifier, A is the data item identifier. Here 950 is the updated value of the data item A. The initial value of A is 1000 and assume initial value of B is also 2000 and C is 700. And after reducing 50 rupees from A account, A value becomes 950. Okay, this is the new value which need to be updated into the database. But in case of deferred database modification, the update can be made into the database only when T0 successfully, when it successfully executes all its operation. Okay, and when it executes write on B, then it makes the corresponding update record into the log T0 B 2050, and here 2050 is the updated value of B. So initially it was 2000. Since T0 it transfers the amount 50 rupees from account A to B, and after the transaction B account it contains 2050. Okay, even now also there is no modification is made into the database because it is the deferred database modification technique. And when T0 end is executed, it means this transaction executed all its instructions, so it makes T0 commit record into the log. Okay, so at this point in time the transaction is said to be partially committed. So now when the transaction partially committed, all the updates are made into the database now. Here you can see the old values of A and B are no more available. The A and B, it both got the new values 950 and 2050. So since the database updates can be made only after the partial commit of the transaction, it is known as deferred database modification technique. Similarly, when T2 transaction begins its execution, it makes the start record for T1, and when it performs the write operation on C, it makes the update record on a log, and when it ends, it makes the corresponding commit record into the log. And after the commit record into the log only, it makes the corresponding update into the database. In this way, deferred database modification technique, it updates the database only after the partial commit of the transaction. Okay, and the very notable point here is any update can be made into the database only after making the corresponding entry into the log first, then only any change made into the database. Okay, so like this deferred database modification technique, it keeps track of all the activities of transaction by recording log records into the log, and it ensures the consistency of the database by using the log entries into the log whenever the system failure occurs. Okay, let's now discuss by taking different cases when system failure occurs and when the system resumes back from the failure, how this technique ensures the consistency of the database with suitable scenarios. Okay, in case 1, assume that the transaction failure happened after the execution of write operation on B. When write operation on B is performed, the log may contain T0B 2050, it is the update record. Okay, so at this point in time, if system failure occurs, here transactions are executed while when it is being executed, the transactions code were in RAM only, right? So RAM is a volatile memory. When system failure happens, when it resumes back from failure, no content will be available. So the database management system doesn't have any idea what were the previous transactions were executed and the status of database also, it do not have any idea. However, it has to ensure the consistency of database by referring to the entries into the log and applying the corresponding recovery procedure. Okay, so now since this technique is deferred database modification technique, when the system resumes from the failure, then it applies only the redo procedure is applicable in case of deferred database modification technique, and this redo procedure is applied on committed transactions only. Committed transaction contains both start as well as commit record. Here, if the transaction is uncommitted, then the log entries are simply ignored in order to ensure the consistency of database. Here in our case, T0 is the uncommitted transaction because it do not have the corresponding commit record. Okay, so it contains only the start record. So this is uncommitted transaction, so these log entries are simply ignored, and so when it is simply ignored, still the database is in consistent state, you can observe, because when the transactions are being executed, its initial values were not at all modified. Okay, let us take one more scenario where transaction failure occurs after the successful execution of transaction T0. Okay, when transaction T0 is successfully executed, at this point in time, if system failure occurs, when the system resumes back from the failure, it look into the log. The log contains T0 start as well as commit record. Okay, since T0 is the committed transaction, on this it applies redo procedure. Okay, it applies redo recovery procedure to recover the consistency of database. Okay, when redo procedure is applied on T0, the updated value of A and B are again applied to the database. Again applied to the database. Okay. So A and B values are reapplied to database. Okay, let us take one more scenario where system failure occurs at the end of the successful execution of both T0 as well as T1 transactions. Okay, here assume that at this point in time, after the successful execution of T0 as well as T1, at this point in time, if system failure occurs, when the system resumes from the failure, it look into the log and it sees both the transactions are committed transaction. So when both are committed transactions, it applies redo procedure on both T0 as well as T1. When redo operation is applied, those are applied in forward direction. First redo operation is applied on T0 and redo is applied on T1. Okay, so when redo is applied, again the updates on A and B are reapplied once again into the, and when they are reapplied, once again they are rewritten to the database. Okay, so A is 950, B has 2050, C has 600, right? Once again those values are updated into the database. Okay, when redo is applied, these values are once again updated into the database. Okay, so this is about deferred database modification technique. Students, if you find this video useful to you, kindly subscribe this channel.